So now the question is, if it's all big alive and it's all trying to adapt to each other, then how in the world, what are the things that turn it on and allow it to adapt to new situations? I mean, if you're going to go into a new space and it's really different and it doesn't look anything like what it is, how does it do it? Well, there is a common way that science knows, and they say it's serotonin. And serotonin exists in plants and animals and humans. And under environmental stress, its production increases in plants, animals, and humans. And it alters the neuronal structure and development, and it allows the emergence of adaptive responses to change conditions. It makes you happy if you get a kind of a flood of serotonin in your body. You get happy, but what it also does is it allows you to function in a time of stress or environmental kind of change. And it exists everywhere. What you find out is that if you're messing around with your cows and they don't, and it's really stressful on them, they'll go eat the plants that generate the serotonin. You know what it is? It's psilocybin. It's the psilocybin derivatives, which come from magic mushrooms and DMT kind of things that come from ayahuasca and such. And they go find them, and what it does is it opens up in their own, and plants do the same thing. At times of stress, when they're trying to adapt to something that's coming along, they go out and they generate this kind of psilocybin stuff, which then turns on the serotonin and then allows them to go operate in a new space and deal with a new space in a new way. And so these psychoactive compounds, they exist in the root section of all grassland echo ranges, and this is what generates so much plasticity, the ability to change, and resilience in the system. It allows more effectively processed data about its environment and to generate solutions. Wow, they're all on drugs. I mean, what is it? What you got is psychoactive compounds equal more data and better solutions. And so what is it, this natural kind of thing that starts to allow people to allow whatever to move themselves out of a familiar kind of place into a new place, where that otherwise it opens the horizon. It gives you, expand your perspective to see things. So what you've got is things like ayahuasca and the other things that a lot of people are doing. And one ends up, this is a great quote, ends up one of the ends that explicitly induce human beings to consume ayahuasca, and by extension hallucinogens in general, exists in relation to certain cognitive processes which allow for the improvement in adaptive efficiency. You know what that means? The big words that all mean. That the system produces that kind of stuff at just the time that it needs to adapt itself to a new environment. So if you're going to move yourself into a new space, if the rate of change is great, that things are chaotic and there's uncertainty and it's all going on, think what your body, what the system, no matter where you are in the whole hierarchy of the processes, is it produces these kind of ways to see the world in a different way that therefore allow new ideas to come through. You think that it's not happening now? Shoot, ayahuasca is a big deal. BBC and Vanity Fair and National Geographic and Time and New York Times, and I mean, this is just the first page of Google. What I found was all about, people doing ayahuasca one place or another, and you just got to ask yourself. Now remember, ask yourself in the sweep of where this is all going, in the context of what's this going from one place to another, why does that show up now? Why in the world are marijuana being legalized, huh? And it's just not because a bunch of hippies got old enough to, get in the government or whatever it is. I mean, it's got a bigger kind of context here that starts to say what the organism is doing is opening up the ability of the human beings in order to make sense out of an emerging kind of space that is nothing like it's been in the past, so that new ideas can come up. So what do you say after that? Well, you say that microbes are alive and they're intelligent and they exhibit sophisticated social behavior. They know about their environment and they communicate across societies. Plants are sentient and directly interact and communicate with the intelligent microbes and with other species. I mean, it's all alive. That humans are an integral component of the Gaian system, and they contribute to it and are influenced by the larger system. And in times of stress and need to adapt, microbes, plants, animals, humans all access psychoactive substances to be able to access more data and generate better solutions.
There's an article, the guy who was scientist saying that the bacteria in your gut determine what you want to eat.
They sure do me. They talk to me every day and they tell me to eat stuff I don't want to eat. I know how that works. Yeah, they do. And I believe that they're in there because they show up at about a certain time every day and they tell me to. So now if you start to raise this up then into the human system, and you start to say, look at those patterns. Look at those same kinds of patterns. And if you go to the human system, what are people saying about those patterns? Bill Strauss and Neil Howe, who used to be friends of mine, Bill's not with us anymore, but they have done some amazing books called Generations in the Fourth Turning. And this is, I don't know, 25 years ago. And what they essentially did is they looked at all of the generations and the characteristics from the beginning of when the Mayflower, the guys came over, the Pilgrims on the Mayflower or whatever, and up until the present. And what they figured out was that there were 4 definitive generational types. For now, let's call them, well, you can't, one of them is nomad, one is hero, one is artist, and one is prophet. Let's say A, B, C, D. And what they say is that there are one generation will produce a certain kind of set of children that will have a predictable set of characteristics, and their children will have a different set of characteristics, and their children will have another set of different characteristics, and then it starts over again. And it goes A, B, C, D, A, B, C, D, A, B, C, D, and we're now at the 4th turning. This has happened 4 times, and we're now turning the 4th time. And it only makes sense when you think about it, because you say, well, if your grandfather acted a certain way and your parents acted this way, then you'll probably react in this kind of way and probably raise your kids in a different way, right? And what they find out is that children tend to overcompensate for the perceived excesses of their parents by raising their own children the opposite of how they were raised themselves. So that if they were kind of, it's hard to see here, but this says abandoned. The nomad, the characteristic of the nomad is abandoned. That's an archetype, a generational archetype. If you felt abandoned, then what you're going to do is protect your kids, right? And if you protected your kids, then you suffocate, and then indulgent, and then abandoned, protected, so suffocate, and indulgent. And so you get this kind of swinging back and forth, predictable swinging back and forth because of whatever happened to you. And it really makes sense. And so what happens is you have these 4 kind of generational archetypes. Say the artist, the hero, the nomad, and the prophet. And the artist is, artistic, open, and then and the prophet is kind of spiritual and values and religion and idealistic. And the hero over here is the guy who runs it. The guy stands up and does a community and all that kind of stuff. And the nomad is reactive, about liberty, survival, and honor. Okay. And so you get these clear kind of characteristics in these generational sets, and they go around predictably from one to another. So you start here with the artist, and then it goes to the prophet, and then and these are birth dates, by the way. So from this part of the time, you had the artist, and then the prophet, and then the nomad, and then the hero, and it goes around. That's predictable. If you know how that works, you can just run that thing out for another 20 years, and you can say, what's that start to look like out there? What are the kind of people who are the who have been raised by the kind of parents that and we already know who they are. We know what they did, and so we know how this can be. And so, starting in 1901, you had this GI generation, they called them, and they were the heroes. They were all about community and affluence and technology. And then, starting at about 1924, you get the silent generation, which were the artists. They were about pluralism and expertise and due process, like artists are. And then the prophets came along with their vision and values and religion and structure and tell you to do this. And the nomad followed that and said liberty and survival and honor. And then it starts over again. And so you can run this thing out and you can see, and what you have is cyclical patterns of parenting about how protective parents are as they go from the hero to the artist. They're overly protective for the artist. They're kind of indulgent for the prophet. The nomad is abandoned and they're underprotected. That's why they're abandoned, right? And the hero is protected, and so on. And so, there's this pattern to all of this. It's really quite cool. And you can get yourself, and you can start to see what's on the near edge. Now, the thing that's important to us today is that when this thing turns and it goes over, what happens is you get certain places in this cycle, you get a crisis. When it goes from hero to artist, you get a crisis, and they've always been the Depression, the Civil War, the what, and they all predictably, if you go back and look at them, they show up every 90-some years or something like that, and it's all a function of these contributing, converging factors about how the people who are all the players look at the world and how they respond to things, because that's what their parents, their grandparents did this, and their parents did this, and so on. And we're right at a time of crisis. Which it goes from founding to awakening to unraveling, then you have a crisis, and then you refound the thing, and then you start to get awakened for a while, and then it unravels. And so the fourth turning is all about, the book is all about predicting that there's this thing coming up at the end of this turning when the thing is going to get a crisis, and then it's going to drive it off into a new space. And so you can look, I told you, it's predicted. So you can go back here and you can look at these things. So here's childhood, young adult, midlife, elders, right? And so somebody gets born here, and as they grow through life, through young adulthood, midlife, and so on, they show up at different times, at different years. And what you can see is that the boomers, who are there's a number of us in this room, you start back here in the 1945, 50, and so on, born in that period of time, and you get the young adulthood in the 80s or something, and you get midlife in 95 or 2000, and so you can work yourself out here, and you can see where here's the high period, and then they awaken, and then they unravel, and then they have a crisis, and then they go high again, and you can see yourself, and so you can look out here 20 years into this period of time at the edge, and you can say, well, what's going to happen in there? Well, you can say that the midlife thing are going to be the nomads. They're going to kind of run the things. The elder people are going to be the prophets. The millennials are coming up in through here, and so they'll be young adults. But what happens classically and predictably is that the people in midlife are the ones who run it all. They make all of, they're the leaders in business, they're the leaders in politics, they're the whatever it is. And so you want to say, what's that look like? Well, Generation X is going to be out in there. And they want to ensure that they've heard, and all you got to do is look at Silicon Valley and the IT companies, and you say this all over it. Yeah, they just want the smartest person in the room, and they don't care what they look like, how do you dress? They don't give me this bright guy, and I'll give him $200,000. They're reactive pragmatists and prefer to just do it, get on it, go. They've been ignored, untrained, unmonitored, untutored. Bill Gates come to mind, and then to educate themselves about how the world works. Gen Xers have a premium on life balance and the integrated kind of life. And they don't trust the system. Relentless layoffs have made them. They don't trust the system anymore. They're born during an awakening, and what they end up being, and they come of age as alienated post-awakening adults, and they become pragmatic midlife leaders during a crisis. and they age into residual. What do you need more than pragmatic leaders in a time of high rates of change, right? So it's almost like the system is producing the generation and the people to be able to effectively make sense out of what goes forward. I mean, you don't want crazy people dealing with all of this uncertainty. I mean, you want some kind of organized, kind of predictable kind of reaction. So you come out of that and you say, so what? We're due for a major pulse, a planet-wide event. The dominant child-rearing archetype will be the artist, with parents that are overprotecting their kids. Have you ever, does that ring any bells? Man, I read about these people and how they just don't let their kid go anywhere, do anything, and they're scared to death it's going to get hurt or whatever. I mean, it's amazing they were protected compared to how I was raised. Nomads will be the predominant drivers. They'll become pragmatic midlife leaders. So, that's another piece of the thing that says going forward what it'll look like. So now, we've looked at it kind of in big kind of terms. So now you start to say, now, how do you hone in on individuals? And how do they, in the personal development as you go through here? Now, everybody's familiar with this, even if you haven't seen this picture, because this is the Maslow hierarchy of needs. And you all know about Maslow's hierarchy of needs. It says that, you know, at the most fundamental level, you're looking for air, water, food, shelter, sleep, and sex. And if you don't get that, man, you're not getting anywhere further. I mean, you just have to, you got to get that first. And if you can get that going, if you got a head, you know, shelter over your head, you got some food and things, then you can start to talk about safety and security. And once you feel safe and secure, then you can expand into love and belongingness, and then if you got that, you can do into self-esteem, and then you get self-actualization and creativity and authenticity and all other kind of things. That's Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And what it says is that, you know, if you get, you can drive yourself down the system and have the ability, if the conditions change, then you have to kind of work yourself up again to where you're in the space where it all feels good again. Well, there's a guy named Claire Graves who was a professor at Union College or something like that in New York. And he had what he called the cycles of emergence theory. And this is one of the most profound kind of frameworks for trying to make sense of how humans kind of evolve, and by extension, by the way, societies that there's been around. And what he says is that there's essentially a ladder kind of process that you go from one step to the next step to the next step. Steve McDonald, a friend of mine from Australia, has probably carried this whole body of knowledge further forward. And he's been in Berkeley Springs, by the way, and he'll probably come back again. But he is a very bright guy who has thought about how this is, spent 20 years consulting about using this framework for businesses and organizations. And he draws these pictures, and this is, I hope you can all see this thing, but it essentially says is that as an individual and as a society evolves, that they work their way from this instinctual survival kind of level up to tribes and safety, and then they move to power and domination. And so this would be tribes like in Africa and other kind of places like that. And then from that they become power, that they move out of the tribal space, and they're interested in power and domination. So you could say kind of medieval kind of things like that. And from that then it becomes societies that are organized around order and authority. What you have here is individuals going up this side of the thing, and you have organizations and societies going up this side. So change here produces this kind of orientation, which then allows this emergence, but then drives into that space and so on. And when you get up to, and here's where we are in the West right now. We're into enterprises and excelling, right? How do you get ahead, and how do you make a big business, and how do you do enterprises and big global businesses and organizations, and that's where we are right now. Now the thing about this process is that it's fractal, that each one of the succeeding positions or orientations or perspectives include the downstream, the upstream ones, right? If that's about these guys down below, but the thing about it is that you look at them, you look down at them, and you say that, you know, this perspective and this way that I look at the world is far superior to how those people live. And so the enterprise kind of folks look down on their, you know, you look down on the medieval things, or the guys running these banana republics, and you say, you know, those guys are. But you know about how it works. You process it all, but you see yourself exclusively at this one place. And what they talk about very profoundly is that there is and you're going from this kind of enterprise and excelling model up toward the network and equality, to where everybody's connected and interconnected, and there's more egalitarianism, and that there's cooperation and stuff like that. And that's where it's going. But even the people at that level all look down on everybody else. That's the tree huggers. You know, these are guys up in here, and they I've got those, you know, those polluters down here in this enterprise outfit, and these guys over in Africa are just killing everybody. You know, they look down on them. Then there's this interesting kind of transition, and they call this the second tier. This is the first tier and the second tier. And there are a very small number of humans, a fraction of 1% almost, that are making it over into this area of integrated and adaptation. And the thing about this is that these guys are integrated, and that they understand and accept that all of these other things that are going on are happening and part of the process, and they don't look down on it. And so that's the tip of the ice. That's where this is all going. But right now, where we're going is from enterprise to network equality. And so what Steve McDonald says, this is the biggest shift since the Enlightenment, from the entrepreneurial world to the network world. In the 60s was the first pulse, the first attempt to, and by the way, astrologers, those of you in this room, if any of you all, you'll say this. You say the same. I've heard it multiple times from astrologers, and they say the 60s pushed this big thing, and then it'll come back, and it'll come back around about now. And so this will now become the dominant paradigm within the next 5 years or so. And it'll be a transition to a new world. You're going to get a fundamental mind shift. It's going to be distributed intelligence, like the internet, right? You're going to get shift from individual governments to networks, so relationships and collaboration and associations, and you're going to get distributed systems, power, banking, Bitcoin. You can see it all happening right now, is that you're disintermediating the centralized kind of nature of the way the world has worked up until now. Groups are going to be smarter than individuals, and so there's communities and things, whether they're virtual and they're online or not, that they're increasingly, you're going to reach out and find yourself in the context of other people as being able to operate in this space. And you're going to move from an outer world to an inner world, from deciding who you are and deciding making your decisions and what your values are, from external to being inside. Some sociologists and folks who think about this talk about this being an experiential generation, an experiential time, inner about this, rather than outside acquiring things, as has been. And again, as above, so below, it's ebb and it flows, and it's just ebbing and flowing. And so it keeps going, and it's kind of 2 steps forward, 1 back, and 2 steps forward, but the current upsurge, Steve thinks, is going to establish itself, and it's going to, we're riding this wave into this new space. So what's the takeaway from that? Clear movement toward interdependence, increasing value and capability arising from networks and collaboration. You get individually as part of networks, empowered vis-a-vis institutions. I mean, you can see that all the time. It's right on the edge. The whole notion of how politics gets played is going to change, because the internet's going to allow representative, really not representative, but direct kind of government involvement in the future. Acceleration into a new direction, that's where we're going, and we're going to search for inner peace, and we're going to be more of going along with rather than fighting and trying to dominate. So let me go one more, and then we'll start to wrap this up. So now you say to yourself, now how does that transition happen? How might this whole thing, we're seeing that we're going, we've got some characteristics of what the world is going to be coming downstream. And how does it kind of start to happen from here? And if up, as above, so below, and as below, so above, then there ought to be some principles down in the system that will tell us how this transition happens and goes forward. Well, it is. It's phase changes. If you go into physics or, anything in materials and chemistry, you have all these, here's water, right? It goes from solid to liquid to gas, and there are phase changes. And gas doesn't look like liquid, which doesn't look like solid, but it's all, essentially the same stuff, but in different kind of phases. And so you say to yourself, how do those phase changes happen? And what are the characteristics of how that gets from one place to another? And maybe that'll tell us a little bit about how this transition happens. Well, the percolation theory, which is really interesting to me, at least, is that essentially says that if you want to go from this phase to that phase, let's say if you want to go from water to ice, then it happens pretty quick, right? Things freeze. There's just a real narrow couple of degrees, and then it all solidifies. And so how is that solidification, how does that all happen? And what they've found out is that it all depends upon the number of moving parts, kind of. And the more moving parts you have, the faster the change, the it flips faster. So if you have fewer moving parts, like 10, then you get this big dark line, and it takes longer to go from one phase to the next phase. But if you got 1,000 moving parts, it just goes whoop, and it flips just about that fast. So I think we got a lot of moving parts, and so that would suggest that the distinct possibility that this shift could happen very quickly. And what they talk about and the examples they give about how this happens is that essentially, if you're moving from kind of an all-black world to a kind of a white world, what is that transition from being all black as it turns the corner and starts itself up to becoming all white? What does it start to look like? And it starts to look like something like this, is that you get these little bits of pieces, of random pieces of white, and then what you get is you get clustering, that you get adjacencies like this where they're right next to each other, and you essentially get communication across between the individual kind of components. And when it finally starts to really flip, then what you get is large patterns of communication that go across the whole system. And so what you're looking for is these clusters. These clusters always precede and presage what's going to happen. And when they start to come together, then you can say it's moving and it's going that direction. This is a cluster. Berkeley Springs is a cluster. There are a lot of places in this country and across this world where their little clusters come together of like-minded people who are connecting and communicating with each other. And what happens is then the kind of clusters connect to each other, and then you get strings, and then they connect, and you never get rid of there's still medieval people around, right? You know what I mean? There's always remnants all around, but after a while, the clusters dominate, and that's the way the process happens. And you see, if you're not working with squares, but you're working with hexagons, then you get more surface space, more connectivity, more places where it can cluster. And this is like communications, right? That's what this is all about. This is all about communication. And if you give me more places in which I can communicate, a la the internet, then suddenly it amplifies and accelerates the transition process because the word gets around faster, right? And all of a sudden it goes viral, as it were, and whoo, and it shifts and it goes. Particularly if you've got, six sides, and then if you go to 3 dimensions, then crap, it really gets complicated, and then And so what happens, this is kind of great. This is, what it turns out is like this. If you've got, and we've changed colors this time. And so now the dominant clustering ones are the black ones, right? And what they end up is clustering, and then they get close to another one, and then there's clusters and clusters. But around them are all the non-colonizing civilizations, which, just example. And so, almost in the biblical terms, do you know the term that you're in the world but not of the world? You know that? And there's other kind of sayings that say the same thing. But that's how this works. Is that what you are is inside this larger kind of system, and there's all the other folks, but these clusters are together, and they're increasingly connecting to each other. And when you start to get critical mass, then the thing becomes dominant. But the other guys they never go away. I mean, they've still got their guns and all their stuff and whatever they want to do, you know. I'm not talking to you, Carol. So, what's the takeaway? The transition could be very quick. They just start with clusters of like-minded individuals. They increase connections with the internet. And once it gains momentum, and it'll accelerate, and at some level, the old world will feel threatened. Right? They won't know what in the world's going on, and it's coming so fast, and they're losing it, you know? Maybe they already feel that way. You think? A little bit? The NSA and some of those kind of guys. I mean, you know, it's all theoretical. So if you put your arms around all of this and you look forward, what does it say? A major catalytic event will drive us into a rapid emergence of a new world. And it could be things like climate change, or a technological breakthrough like artificial intelligence, or this web capability that I talked to you about. Or it could be a financial transformation, an implosion, a reorganization. It's a big deal, whatever it is. Could be energy breakthrough, could be ending a number of those things at the same time, right? All coming together. Or it could be an external pulse intervention. And what that means is comes from somewhere else. Comes from the sun or the center of the galaxy or some funny looking guy on a little craft that, you know, who knows? You know, it could be. I mean, I'm a futurist. You gotta be open. You gotta consider all these things. Because I can assure you, it's not far-fetched. That's all I can tell you. So it will be a catalytic event. It'll be facilitated by an increased innovation enabled by growing use of psychoactive drugs, overseen by leaders who are pragmatic. I mean, this same-sex marriage and the legalization of marijuana, kind of pragmatism. Yeah, come on, all right, yeah, sure. Let them all get married. Sure, I mean, that's pretty pragmatic. And the process will overcome inevitable attempts by the old world to sustain itself, because we're going forward. I mean, we're not going back. They're going to try, but it's inevitable. And it'll start with clustering of new world kind of people, which is what we're trying to do here. That's why we hold this here. Somebody tried to talk me into holding it in Washington next year. No. We can hold it here. This is where it happens. So going forward, the leadership will be pragmatic. Like I said, the character of life is going to be increasingly open and innovative and adaptive, increasingly interdependent with more community, communities of new thinking that connect to each other. And perspective will be broad and rapidly, necessarily. It will include nature as part of what we are and the one of all of this, because they're all alive, remember? I mean, they're smart, and they're talking to each other, and so we better kind of connect. And then they will embrace the environment for more systemic and inclusive terms. Now, what I've just described to you is a relatively evolutionary perspective, and it's not kind of a revolutionary one, but the revolutionary one might happen. But that's the subject for another talk. But in any case, even if you look at this in these kind of conventional kind of terms going forward, you can see that something really big is coming together, and the character of it is going to be quite different. So then you say, well, can I shape this? Can I influence it, or do I just sit here and kind of get washed ashore by the wave? No, as a matter of fact. Steve McDonald, my Australian friend, has helped build this this thing that essentially says that if you start with an evolutionary impulse, what will come out of that is an internal and external life conditions will start to change. And then core intelligences will then adapt to that. Follow this, now stay with me. The internal, the external life conditions change, so then you look at yourself in a different kind of way, and then your mindset shifts, and then your art, all the structures, your industry, your business, your government, and everything, they all then change. And then you get surface level behaviors, actions, and other kind of influences, but they are all built upon essentially evolutionary impulses is driving us forward, and how relatively fast that's going or not. So yeah, so there's, now you got the structure, and now this is all going, and the question then becomes, how do you get into that system, and how do you drive the system, and how do you make it change? Now you can't read this very well, and if you want these slides, by the way, I'll give you these. Happy to give you the slide. This is Dana Meadows, Janelle. She went by Dana. And she was a friend of a number of friends of mine back when she was alive. She's not now. But one day she figured out a brilliant 12 steps to how do you intervene effectively in a system. And it starts with the least effective and it goes down to the most effective. And I'll just tell you really quickly, it starts with taxes and standards and subsidies and things. That's the least effective way to change a large-scale, nonlinear system. And then you can go into things like delaying things and making it, and then you can do feedback loops. And you can then change the structure, information flows, who does or doesn't get access to information. That's how the government works, is that they control a lot of the flow of information, and that's the way they change things. More effective still is incentives and punishments and things. If you change the incentives, then the whole system reorganizes itself to respond to the incentives. Then you can change the goals, but when you get down to the bottom, the most effective things is the paradigm, the mindset out of which the system, its goals, and other kind of things arise. You got that? I mean, if you change Willis Harman, who used to run the Institute of Noetic Science, wrote a wonderful book many years ago called Global Mind Change or Shift. And the whole thing, and this is what he said. He says that this whole shift that goes in a new direction is going to come from a global mind shift. And by the way, if you then transcend paradigms, if you can go across and go over the top of them, and disconnect yourself, it's like that living in the world but not of the world part, then that's the most effective way to intervene into a system. So Bela Abernathy comes along and he says, I know how to do that. Guided evolution of society. I ran into him in Seattle once at a conference, and he did it. I went over to his house. He's a marvelous man. But he is the man who's done more about systems analysis and how do you manage social systems. And he wrote a book called The Guided Evolution of Society. I mean, that's it, isn't it, right? How do you guide this thing, and how do you make it go forward? And what he said is, and this is my mantra, I mean, this is it. We have entered into the Anthropocene. Man has become the most influential force on this planet. This endows us with a historical responsibility. For the very first time in 7 million years of our evolutionary saga, it is within our power. Indeed, it's our moral duty to become the designers of our future, the guides of our own evolution, and the evolutionary life on Earth, and possibly beyond. That's why we're here. That's it. Nobody else ever had that opportunity or that responsibility. And so Bela said, the way to do that is you develop an evolutionary consciousness and you kind of change the way people think about things. He says that we're a generation, a civilization that has immense drive and has virtually no sense of direction beyond sheer accumulation. Now, I understand that he was writing this about 25 years ago. But it's a dynamic, it's better now, right? It's a dynamic with no moral anchor and no guiding ethic and an economic engine with idea where it's going other than acquisition. I do think it's starting to change somewhat, but that's where he came from, and he says that we can make this something else. So he said an evolutionary guidance system has to transcend this existing state and then envision a new one, and that's really important here, and this is going to come back to that. You've got to have a picture of what the new one looks like, and then transform the system by bringing it the image of life by design into this new state. He had 12, I think a number of lists here, you don't have to remember all this, but he had 9 organizing principles, cultivating knowledge of evolution, you got to know about it, and then values, and then you foster ethics and self-realization and social and ecological things, obtaining cooperative group skills. That's what we're trying to do here a little bit. Acquiring communications techniques, acquiring competence in systems thinking, and so on. But it was pretty kind of theoretical and abstract at that level of saying, yeah, sure, that's the obvious thing and what you ought to do. So, but the framework was there to start to say how this might work and what you could do. So then you go to the next step and you say, okay, so what do I need to execute that? What do I need going forward? What are the minimal, most important things to sustain this transition to this new world and to this new era? Well, number one, the internet. Because the internet is the communications linkages. It's the neuronal network. It is the global brain is what it's becoming. And you've got to have the internet. I mean, if you do the scenario, if you do the no internet scenario, man, that gets in Stone Age really quick. And you just got to keep the internet up. But more than that, you got to have net neutrality. You've got to be open to everyone so that the old existing structures don't constrain and control the flow of information and try to keep it the way it used to be. And so if there was one policy thing that's probably the most important thing for the future of this whole species, it is net neutrality. That you have got to keep this thing open, because if the old guys get a chance to squeeze it, and it just slows the whole thing down and it keeps it. You need a vision, I told you need a vision of this new world. Otherwise everybody's got a different idea and it's all going to go, and they're all going different directions. And somewhere we got to come around and we got to get something that we can all hold up and we can all say, yep, that's a good idea, let's try to do that. And you need to trust the process. Just because there is so many moving parts and it's going places nobody's ever seen before, and it is real easy to get stressed out on this one. That if you don't trust it because you can't understand governance, you don't really know what's going on here. And you have to trust the process, and what you also have to do is have resilience. You have to and it comes in a number of ways. It has to do with structures, it has to do outlook, it has to do with personal perspective. But what you've got to do is be able to know that things are going to happen, and you got to dance, and you got to adjust, and you have to go somewhere else. And that resilience shows up in this slide that Steve McDonald did about how you deal with high rates of change and transitions into new spaces. And he says that it starts out to be stable, and then it starts to get stressful, and then there's a shock or something. And the typical kind of way it goes into, the classic stuff of denial, confusion, and anger, and so on. And then there's a barrier to change. And if you finally get over across the barriers, then it gets relief and excitement and satisfaction and happiness in a new thing. But the point is that you can jump from the time when the first indications are there that show up. You can jump across all of that stuff into the new stability, and you can shortcut the whole thing. And you can start to see this is going to be a different kind of place. Now I got to work on that one, and I'm sorry it's not the way it was in the past. That's where I'm going. And there's almost an element of this that has to be a part of this resilience that says, I'm going to dance. A new thing comes up, I'm going to go a new direction. I can do this,